Hello and welcome to lecture number 16. This is topic 2.5, slave auctions and the domestic slave trade. The first learning objective is to describe the nature of slave auctions in the 19th century United States South. Slave auctions in the United States were terrifying and heartbreaking events. They started with the sale of enslaved people, which would happen either on the deck of a slave ship, at various ports, or at an auction house. Most likely in the United States, this would be located in Charleston, South Carolina. When the enslaved people were about to be sold, the crew or the agent would dress the captives to appear more valuable. This means that they would oil their bodies to try and hide any scars, marks, or bruises. Often, they would also dye their hair to hide any white hairs, all to make them appear more valuable. While the enslaved people were inspected, their bodies would be commodified as if they were animals. Families would often be broken up and sold to different buyers. This included biological families and adopted families created either on the passage of the slave ship or on a previous plantation. At peak times, Charleston alone saw the sale of 10,000 enslaved people annually, making it a hub for their brutal practice. The enslavers and auctioneers justified this treatment with white supremacy doctrines in the slave codes that allowed for the sales to happen in this way and treated Africans as if they were animals or transferable property. Those who resisted their sale were often punished severely by whipping. However, there was a limit to this because any enslaved person showing signs of whippings or scars from their punishment would be thought to be a disobedient laborer, thus lowering their value. The second learning objective is to explain how African American authors advanced the cause of abolition and equality in their writings about slave auctions. African American writers use narratives and poetry to talk about their experiences. In the previous topic, we discussed the genre of slave narratives, and a common occurrence in their lives was being sold at auction. One example is A Life and Narrative of William J. Anderson, in which he mentions the experience of 24 years as a slave, being sold 8 times, jailed 60 times, and whipped 300 times. In these narratives, they describe the physical and emotional effects of being sold. Slave narratives were used to counter the enslavers' claims that slavery was a benign institution and were usually published by abolition societies to advance their causes. When an enslaved person was not able to read and write, they would often tell their story to a white author who would then publish it. This is what the illustration on the screen is showing. The third learning objective is to explain how the growth of the cotton industry in the United States displaced enslaved African American families. After the international slave trade ended in the United States in 1808, there was no longer a way for enslaved Africans to be imported from Africa or the Caribbean islands to do agricultural work. This was part of the compromise from the Constitutional Convention. Because this compromise had been written into the Constitution, earlier attempts to abolish slavery had also failed. Congress, in responding to anti-slavery petitions in its first session in the 1790s, said that because the framers had put in place that 20-year delay, Congress should also wait 20 years before considering any other legislation regarding slavery. By the time the international slave trade ended in the U.S., cotton production was booming and was the most profitable cash crop grown in the U.S., creating a greater demand for labor. Because they couldn't get it from abroad, the enslaved population had to grow primarily through childbirth. There were 3 different ways in which this happened, 2 of them being forced reproduction. Sexual assault from enslavers on enslaved women would yield mixed-race children. Because the slave codes in the United States made slavery a heritable status passed down through the mother's line, all of those children would then be born into slavery. The other forced reproduction tactic was that the enslaver would force pairings on the plantation, forcing a male enslaved person to have sex with a female enslaved person to try and yield offspring from that relation. This was often against the will of both people involved. And finally, slave marriages were consensual relationships between men and women, often with one or both being enslaved. They were also traditionally across different plantations. Depending on the plantation style, they would have the ability to see each other either at nights or on weekends. They would get a pass to go to the other plantation and spend time with each other. However, due to slave codes, the offspring of those slave marriages would belong to the person who enslaved the woman. By 1860, the enslaved population in the United States had grown to nearly 4 million, driven by the internal population growth methods. The slave cotton system dominated the Lower South, which includes the states of South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. These were all places where tobacco agriculture either didn't work or had been exhausted. Another thing they had in common was port cities that they could use to export the cash crop to northern cities or to Great Britain, which was undergoing its industrial revolution based on the textile industry. Enslaved Africans were valuable commodities because of the profit from cotton. The cotton crop was so important to the U.S. economy that it helped end the economic decline after the Revolutionary War and fuel the industrialization that was happening in Britain. Later, it would fuel the industrialization to happen in the Northeast. By the 1850s, cotton constituted more than half of all U.S. exports, underscoring its critical economic role. Because there were no more imports of enslaved people, a domestic trade arose in the United States to meet the demand for laborers from the cotton boom in the first half of the 19th century. One of the reasons for the cotton boom was the new patented cotton gin by Eli Whitney in the 1790s. It was able to clean up to 50 pounds of cotton per day, whereas before, an enslaved person could clean about 1 pound of cotton per day by hand. In the Upper South, the tobacco crop was starting to be less profitable, and northern states had started to pass gradual abolition laws. Those enslavers who were either going to lose their human property or no longer had as much need for it started to sell their enslaved people to the lower southern states. African Americans were forcibly relocated from states like Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas, and Missouri in the Upper South to those states we mentioned earlier in the Lower South. One reason why the Lower South was able to expand its cotton production was the land availability after Indian removal in the 1830s. Southeastern tribes were forcibly removed from their lands to lands west of the Mississippi, allowing new planters to move into those areas to grow cash crops, even those who had exhausted the soil in the Upper South. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 facilitated this massive land grab, displacing thousands of Native Americans. The internal or domestic slave trade is sometimes referred to as the Second Middle Passage because of the length and difficulty it took to get across. Among the enslaved people, there was a fear of being sold down south or being taken by the Georgia man. This doesn't mean they were necessarily going to Georgia, but the Georgia man was associated with a slave agent who would sell enslaved people to the Lower South. In the Second Middle Passage, over 1 million African Americans were displaced. That's 2 times more than the people who had arrived directly from Africa during the original Middle Passage. The modes of transport usually involved marching in groups of anywhere between 50 to 100, chained together in coffles, walking between 20 and 25 miles every day. By the 1840s, the use of steamboats and railroads was more commonly used to transport people in this domestic slave trade, which continues to be the largest forced migration in American history. This internal trade was crucial to the economic expansion of the Lower South, with New Orleans emerging as a major slave trading hub. Slave auctions were places that assaulted the bodies, minds, and spirits of enslaved Africans. African American authors attempted to counter white supremacist doctrines and advance abolition. The domestic slave trade began after the banning of the international slave trade, generating the largest forced migration in American history. Finally, the internal slave trade was fueled by the cotton boom. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, click the thumbnail on the screen. And if you would like more resources to help you study, you can visit apushslides.com/afam. I wish you the best of luck with your studies, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.